bit more than that, so here goes. Transpersonal history is a new field of academic history that includes the scientific and philosophical study of altered states of consciousness, telepathy, clairvoyance, and the psychology of altruistic love, compassion, and enlightenment in the lives of former practitioners and mystics of all ages, cultures, and nations. It arises from the combination of transpersonal psychology with that of academic historiography. Now, to apply this field in the study of theosophical history, and the history of Theosophy will be the theme of this talk, this is Dr. Thomas Craig-Daffern, who has published widely in this field. Now, this is Thomas's life story. It's so much to go into, but if you take it, you'll feel intimidated, but I hope not. It's very approachable. Thomas has spent many years teaching religious studies, philosophy and history to both adults and university students, and has an excellent record and an overview of everything in all aspects of the field, including the links between schools and higher education. He's worked at senior level at secondary schools as a teacher in religious studies, citizenship, history and philosophy, and he's set up mediation schemes in several schools. Thomas offers vision, experience, enthusiasm, expertise, and is a profound and passionate person with commitment to educational research, both in history, philosophical ideas, religious scholarship, and lifelong learning. And therefore he has become a highly effective educator and scholar who's travelled and researched widely, and as a result brings an international perspective to his work. Oh, that's a mouthful. But I can tell you, having visited where he is now, and he probably might refer to this in his work, at the Castle of the Muses up in Loch Gilphead, near Carrick Castle, is the most amazing place. And some of the books which he has brought here will give you an idea of the overview that he's been working on. But in this talk, he's going to introduce his 2010 paper, because this is his passion, towards a national task force on non-violence. It's a founding paper and a proposal to the citizens of the UK. So, without more ado, Thomas, it's your field.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, and Margot for your warm introduction, and Mike for inviting me. Okay, I've got a limited time, so I'm going to stick to my notes fairly strictly. The talk is titled Theosophy and Transpersonal History, an overview of a new genre of historical research and its relevance to Theosophy. This talk is based on a talk I gave in Tel Aviv at the Theosophical Society headquarters in Israel. If anyone's been there, hands up. I was fortunate enough to be invited in April this year to give a talk, a keynote speech at a conference of esotericists in Israel. And some of the people there were also active members of the TS in Israel. They invited me to give like a private talk to them. And so you know, this is the second time I've done this. Unfortunately, I lost my notes of the previous talk. I looked for them. So this is from memory and from the heart. Okay, but it was amazing in Israel. If you get there, they have several flats in Tel Aviv which were donated to the movement by former members. And the one I spoke in was owned by a Bulgarian Jewish guy who fled from the Holocaust, got to Israel, lived for Theosophy, and left it to the society when he died. And that's where they have their meetings as well. He must have been an amazing guy. Okay, so I want to start my introduction with just a little bit of personal introduction on why I've been involved in peace work and philosophical research for many years. I founded a group called Philosophers for Peace back in the 80s, 83, 84, at the time of the Cold War. And I'd been brought up with parents and a culture that were quite concerned about international conflict. and the Cold War, and I felt there was a moral duty on philosophers and intellectuals to get to the grips with what's potentially going to destroy this planet. You know, I think if we're not working to save this planet from self-destruction, then really, you know, what are we here for? Okay, so I was born in '56 in Montreal, and then lived first part of my life in Brighton. And in the 80s in London, I launched this group of philosophers of peace. We used to have meetings in Notting Hill Gate with different scholars, intellectuals, philosophers, both esotericists and conventional thinkers, scientists. My work has always been about bridging those two fields. From 1989 to 1992, I worked for the University of London on staff at the Institute of Education, which is the largest educational research centre in Britain, possibly in the Commonwealth, well, indeed in the Commonwealth. And I travelled as part of my job to about 20 countries worldwide, asking how people can teach and study research, non-violence and peace. Okay, it came out of a project from the University of London to create a National Centre for Peace Studies in London. And it led to the founding of the Peace Studies Institute, which I still direct, called the International Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. So the concern of that work was that conflict, violence and war come out of clashes between people's worldviews, their conceptions, their religious views, what people regard as important in their lives. And when they clash and come into conflict, you see this on a micro level in politics, you know, the right versus the left versus the centre versus the whatever. But on a global level, it's going on, the clash of civilizations and religions. My job is like, I see myself as a medical doctor trying to heal that split. And that is to me what the job of the academic is. And that's the job of philosophy. And the idea of transpersonal history has come up as a medical proposal for mankind, for self-healing, basically. So lots of projects came out of that. I travelled in India 5 times, most recently to Jaipur to receive an award as a non-violence teacher. And I worked, I'll come back to the whole non-violence work in more detail later, but that has always been an important thread here. So, what about esoteric stuff? Okay, that's the kind of conventional thing about my work. At the same time, I've always been fascinated by and interested in esoteric history. I was dissatisfied. I was brought up with a diet of Euro-Marxism. My parents were, you know, traditional Marxists. They were very intellectual, very clever. But I felt very empty. And my brother and sister went to St. Christopher's School, which was founded by Theosophists, as some of you may know. I didn't go there. And I think in the 60s and 70s in Britain, we had a kind of cultural or metaphysical void, I called it. So existentialism and the concepts of social progress were the kind of diet. Now I felt this was vacuous, and when I did my research at the University of London into the history of Marxism, I wrote a paper which is subsequently published on the esoteric origins of Marxism. I discovered that the milieu that Marx and Engels worked in the 19th century was deeply imbued with Freemasonic and esoteric networks. The people out of which Marxism came were philosophical dissidents, right? You probably don't know this, but the guy that put Marx on the International was a member of the Order of Memphis, which was an esoteric Freemasonic body going back to ancient Egypt, so they claimed. Anyway, I stumbled all this, and my academic supervisor said nobody was studying this. You know, this was you know, sort of raised eyebrows, and aren't you going off a bit here? You know, this isn't exactly straight academic work. But it was a furrow I ploughed, and I corresponded with other historians, like a guy called Elliott, who wrote a load of stuff on the occult dimensions of Nazism, because there's also a whole esoteric history to the right, as well as to the left. And I corresponded with Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who is now director of the Centre for the Study of Esotericism at the University of Exeter, who did a doctoral thesis on the occult origins of Nazism. Some of you may know his work. what I just basically came to realise is that European history is not being told properly, it's not being taught properly or researched properly. There's a whole esoteric underground, right, which is not on the conventional academic syllabi. You don't get taught this when you do your A-level courses of World War I or II, but I assure you it's really, really important. And I also joined the Theosophical Society. I used their superb library in London for this research. I joined the Lucis Trust library, used their work, the Alice Bailey tradition, which came out of Theosophy. I also, heresies galore, joined the Anthroposophical Society to use their library, because I admire Steiner's work. And he was a dissident Theosophist, head of the German branch, as you know. And I, for a time, was the librarian at Steiner House in London. And I catalogued the secret archives in the basement, which nobody had looked at since about the 1950s. They're all just mouldy old papers lying away in a safe. I actually made it my business to archive them and discovered some of Steiner's lectures, which had never been really brought to life before. Way ahead of his time, talking about the metaphysics of relativity theory, Einstein's views. This is just before Steiner died. Steiner also published a series of lectures called the Karma Lectures, which are about a sort of esoteric look at history. My sorrow as a historian is that these esoteric movements should have ever been in competition, you know, as unfortunately happened when Steiner and Besant and Krishnamurti all fell apart. But fortunately, as an academic, it's not my job to take sides, okay? It's my job simply to study the whole lot, practicing suspension of judgment. So I did that. I finished my degree at the University of London in Eastern European history, specialising in Russian history. And I gave a paper to Leslie Price's Theosophical History Centre on theosophical history as a particularly East European thing. I mean, you know, Blavatsky was obviously Russian, from the Dolgoruki family, with a huge library of esoteric stuff as a child she drew on. Steiner was from Eastern Europe, so was Gurdjieff and others of these greats of esoteric teachers. Why? It's something I explored. So esoteric history has always been a fascination to me. So what then, the third thing I want to ask is, what is transpersonal history? I've written it up here. It's the combination, as Margot said, of transpersonal psychology with conventional history. You know, as a history graduate, you're taught economic history, diplomatic history, political history, if you're lucky, a bit of feminist history or gender history, a bit of you know, social history and stuff. But you cannot do history of religions, but that's always done fairly conventionally. A history of Christianity, history of Islam and stuff. Where's esoteric history? Who's addressing it? Well, nobody really, except there are pockets, as I've said. Nicholas Goodrick Clark in Exeter University, and there was a historian called James Webb, some of you may have heard of, who wrote two amazing books back in the 80s, documenting the occult underground, the history of it, from Mesmer's time in the Enlightenment up to you know, modern day. There's a new research interest in what's called now the Dark Enlightenment. Everybody talks about the Enlightenment. That's a big thing in Scotland. You're proud of Adam Smith and all that lot. Reason. The Enlightenment period had another side to it, which historians are now calling the Dark Enlightenment, which was an interest in the occult and mysticism and people like Mesmer. And there was an amazing guy called Antoine Cour de Gebelin, based in Paris, who was the Grand Master of a lodge of Freemasons called the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which included among its members Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Jeremy Bentham, Lavoisier, and I could give you a roll call of like hundreds of the most important names of the Enlightenment. And this guy they were all deeply involved in esoteric research and mysticism. This is now finally beginning to be studied. Transpersonal history, therefore, is a tool. You know, how can we study all this? Some historians would write this up tongue-in-cheek and say, well, these people are crazy. You know, they're all mad. And from a Freudian perspective, if you're going to have a Freudian view of the psyche, you would say, well, it's displaced eros or something, you know. I don't take that view. I think we need a new methodology. And I based the notions of transpersonal history on my deep study of Jung's ideas. Now, Jung talks about, he was a kind of transpersonal historian. He talks about the influence of archetypes in history and how different thinkers, he talks about Meister Eckhart and others. In his writings, Jung was an incredible scholar. And he says that these different philosophers, and he mentions Nietzsche and Aristotle and the whole lot, they're pursuing different archetypes of what is wisdom. What is the dominant thought, energy that they're running on. So Jung's ideas are very influential. And so transpersonal history is a combination of other transpersonal thinkers, particularly a guy called Ken Wilber, you may have heard of, who's done a kind of map of the collective psyche of mankind as it unfolds over the centuries. But also Roberto Assagioli, who coined psychosynthesis, and is a great Italian Jewish mystic, and was a friend of Alice Bailey. I published a dictionary. I mean, to do the research for this, I had to just take time out and go and live in an ashram in Wales for 10 years, and just bury myself in books, right? Simultaneously teaching secondary school kids religious studies. But the fruit of it was eventually a doctoral thesis, right? This is the appendix to the doctoral thesis that I published separately, which is an A to Z of all transpersonal thinkers active in this timeline, 1945 to 2001. I did this because this is useful. There's no other book like this on the planet. Nobody's thought of doing it or done it yet. It lists all the transpersonal thinkers from every culture and religion during this crucial timeline. And the focus of my research, the reason for coming up with this, is given by the end date, 2001. What happened on 9/11/2001 is the archetypal sort of wake-up call for mankind, really. If we don't crack this, if we don't find a mature and scientific way to discuss religious differences with, say, the Islamic world, we're going to end up with balls of steel flying all over the place and just, have a big end of the world party, which is very destructive. I believe in the power of wisdom and learning and science and the advancement of knowledge, like Francis Bacon. So I say, rather, let's dialogue and talk and research. So you've got Islamic thinkers in here, as well as Jewish and Buddhist and Hindu and Theosophical and so on. Okay, how does all this overlap with Theosophical history? I've talked about transpersonal history. Well, considerably. If you think about the modern story of Theosophy, we're dealing with transpersonal thinkers. We're dealing with Blavatsky, who was an amazing mystic and eclectic who studied from Russia and then wherever she travelled in the Middle East and probably Tibet. I think the evidence is she did get there. Certainly India and the States. It overlaps, of course, with the great interest in spiritualism in the 19th century and this breakthrough into another dimension. So clairvoyance and spiritualism. Again, the history of that is part of transpersonal history. It's the history of mankind striving to contact interdimensionality phenomena behind existence. Conventional history deals with the sort of two-dimensional stuff. I'm interested in the third dimension as well, or the fourth. But also in the history of all the others around that movement, Olcott and all these people, many of whom were Freemasons, with their own long esoteric histories. And if you study the history of Theosophy, as a number of scholars have done, it's fascinating stuff. These guys were passionate about their beliefs. What I like about them is they're open-minded to the ultimate truth. And the whole, if you look at the principles, the objects of the Theosophical Society, it's about creating a nucleus for research into spirituality and science and their reconciliation. They were way ahead of the game, really. Deserve to be taught more. I mean, as head of religious studies in schools, I always do a lesson on Theosophy, and kids have never heard of it. Haven't got a clue what you're talking about, which to me is scandalous. But then, as I say, I'm interested in wider theosophical currents. So I looked in great detail at Steiner's life and teachings and the history of the anthroposophical movement, which has also had its inner splits. And I was influenced by Sir George Trevelyan quite a lot. He was quite an interesting man. and he was a member of the Theosophical Society who mandated me. You know, he had to get a backer. But he was utterly eclectic, shamelessly eclectic, and a poet, as I am. But then there are other groups like the Golden Dawn and you know, the overlap with all the esoteric currents around in the 19th century, 20th century. That's part of the wider theosophical tradition that I'm interested in. And indeed, I want to take you back briefly to the question of what are the original roots of theosophy? What do we actually mean by this? You probably know that the term was coined by an Alexandrian Neoplatonist called Ammonius Saccas. Great name. Some people say Saccas was related to Shakyamuni, the you know, sort of neo-Buddhist. Because certainly in Alexandria, they knew of Buddhism and Eastern currents. Alexandria had the greatest library in the world, esoteric stuff. And, Ammonius was a pagan who believed in the universal wisdom underlying all religions. And he argued that it's not enough just to study them objectively, so-called, but to live them, to walk the path at the same time as studying them. You know, study and prayer and ethics go together, as they do in yoga, and as they should in all genuine academic. So Ammonius's concept of theosophy was to find the divine wisdom underlying, well, all existence, really. The Sophia being wisdom, Theos, the divine. But Theos comes from a root meaning light, which is related to the old, actually the word Zeus, and Deus in Latin. It's the inner light or energy vibration that everything's made of. Einstein calls it the sort of, you know, the maximal speed. I'm not sure about that myself. I think thought travels faster than light, and one day we'll prove it. But Theos is the ultimate reality that everything's made of. So, in a sense, I was trying to explain to my daughter that philosophy, if philosophy is beer, theosophy is like whiskey. It's the spirit of distilled philosophy. Okay. Now, there's an interesting question there, and this tradition of theosophy has existed not just from Alexandria, but in all the religions since. So, I just had a visit from a Persian from Shiraz, who was visiting my class of the Muses, and we were talking about Suhrawardi, who was a great Islamic theosophist. There's a school in Persian mysticism, in Shiism, called the Illuminationist School, or the Theosophical School. And it's the heart of Persian mysticism, right to this day. And I'm trying to organise some philosophical dialogues between Persian thinkers and American, because I had an American visiting at the same time. Sort of heading off World War III through sublimating it into theosophical dialogue. Okay. So let's talk about illumination rather than mutual destruction. Okay, the transpersonal history has a lot to say, as you can see, to the history of religions. And in all religions, you find a theosophical current, right? So, but it can only be explored and understood by analysing it transpersonally. I mean, I've been reading a biography of John Knox. I've just been in the Giles Cathedral, studying his life from a transpersonal perspective, you know, in a neutral sort of scientific way. This guy was a profound person. You can love him or hate him, or it's hard to be indifferent. You know, he was a passionate advocate of his own understanding of spirituality. And there are thousands of people in the history of European Christianity. I've just been in Halle in Germany and saw Luther's death mask. If anyone's been there, I recommend, you know, it's a very profound thing to see. Again, here was a guy who had profound numinous encounters in a thunderstorm, and it changed European history. So my question scientifically is, what was going on in Luther's mind? Say, what was actually happening, scientifically speaking? Or indeed in the mind of St. Paul, when he had a similar experience? I think it's time to ask these questions. I think it's also true of Islam. We can ask the question scientifically, what was going on for Muhammad when these revelations were coming to him in the cave outside Mecca? I'm recording a commentary on the Quran at the moment. I'm 50 surahs in. It's a year-long project. As a religious studies scholar, commenting on the Quran text from a transpersonal historical perspective, which means I'm combining the data about Muhammad's life, his personal life, his political life, the whole works, with his spiritual life. Now, Muhammad was a man of limited education. This is simply a fact. He knew nothing of Greek philosophy. He'd never heard of Plato or Aristotle, never heard of Ammonius Saccas, never heard of Buddhism. You know, he had quite a narrow conceptual framework of Arabic-based legendary history and certain smatterings of Christianity and a lot of Judaism. He'd met rabbis, he knew people, and some Zoroastrianism. Put it in a mélange, you get Muhammad's psyche. Give some strong dose of actual spiritual experiences, including, I think, some out-of-body experiences. I think Muhammad's night journey is a classic case of an out-of-body experience. He actually goes to Jerusalem out of body. You know, he doesn't know what's happening. For him, it's an angel taking him on a horse. That's his vocabulary to explain it. But I think, you know, it's a duty now on scholars to really try and understand what's going on, because there's no way, in my understanding from a transpersonal historical perspective, that Muhammad or the verses of the Quran anywhere say, do 9/11s, or, you know, blow up the unbelievers, or kill the infidel. They're actually, on the contrary, all about peace, about forgiveness, and about finding the one, the ultimate, you know, and surrendering to that ultimate. Well, that to me is exactly what Theosophy is about. It's finding the ultimate truth behind, you know, there's no religion higher than truth, is the motto, right? Well, Muhammad, I think, would agree with us on that. Of course there isn't, there can't be by definition. But we can't stop the journey. It's when you say, well, we've now stopped the journey, that was the final truth, that's the last prophet, that's closure, just do what we do. That's when I, as a esotericist, you know, get twitchy and I say, look, you're blocking people's right to access the transpersonal here. If you're closing down on our accessing the transpersonal, to me, everyone has prophetic skills and abilities. And if the New Age movement tells us anything, it's that we all have, if you develop it, those channeling capacities and so on. So I think there is a huge dialogue needed with you know, the Middle East and Islamic world and the West. And Theosophy can play an enormous bridge. This is why I was so fascinated to be giving this talk in Israel. And look what's going on in Israel. There's a new current, a new mood. And people are saying, actually, we want to be the Moses of today. We want new commandments. You know, we want love on the streets and in our lives. And they're saying it in Cairo and Libya and Syria. The problem is, of course, when the violence comes in. You know, what does one do with that? Let me come on to that. To make simple the study of religions, what I've done is produced a periodic table, pinching the idea of Mendeleev with a chemical table of the elements. So I published this book, Periodic Table of the World's Religions and Philosophical Traditions, and there's a chart, a big chart that comes with this. This is the data. It's on a website. You click on the table and the data comes up. And it's a tool for university students, school kids, adults. You know, it's the and it's very interesting. If you want a copy of the table or the book and stuff, you can you know, contact me. It's available online. Just Google it. You can get it. You can get it as a download, etc. So it's until we can't get peace on the planet until we get intelligent discourse about each other's belief systems. That's just for starters, right? It's like people in a restaurant arguing, hurling plates across the room because they're arguing about the menu. They all speak different languages. You know? Like, no, you don't do that. You sit down, you look at the menu, and you order what you want. You know, in a language that you can understand. At the moment, we've got chaos. We've got barroom behaviour going on in a. You know, nobody's eating anything. We're all starving from lack of wisdom, I'd say, which is the real shortage on this planet, not money. One of the themes underlying the work I've done on the periodic table of religions is I think we really need to rediscover the importance of pagan religions. As a religious studies teacher, I've always been at pains to tell the kids, look, Yes, there's Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. There's also the pagan religions. And there's a lot of interest, I think, nowadays. You probably know that in Estonia, paganism is the fastest growing religion. You know, many cultures are going back to their earliest roots. Okay? In this world, the Celtic sort of part of the world, the ancient Druid path was the original pagan religion. And it's something I've spent quite a long time researching in detail. Among other things, I've been involved with a thing called the Council of British Druid Orders. I run an order of Druids working for peace, and currently the kind of Archdruid of the Peace Druids of Britain. So it's just led me to some very interesting encounters, including an immortal encounter with a Sufi in Palestine who was about to shoot me as a member of the MI6. But then when he discovered I was an Archdruid, he embraced me as his long-lost brother. He said, "Where have you been all these years?" You know. So another thing so the pagan religions are very important, and I think they've often been suppressed and silenced by the literate religions. You see, one interesting thing to remember is Theosophy was never written down. You can't write it down, even though Blavatsky and others have tried to produce these enormous tomes. The actual thing is a living spirit. Ammonius Saccas, bless him, never wrote a book, you see. Never wrote anything. He just taught. And he linked in to spirit. And then he communed with other friends who did the same. That was the heart of Theosophy, in its living essence. And that was the heart of ancient paganism. Right? That's what our ancestors did for millennia before we invented writing. Writing, I think, has confused everything. As Plato pointed out in the dialogues, when Thoth brings us writing skills, it actually makes our memory less able to remember stuff. Oral cultures have these amazing traditions and legends passed down orally, and I think we should remember that. So, like Socrates, I advocate knowledge as remembrance. You guys all know, you're all fully enlightened. I'm just here to point that out to you. I'm just saying, remember that. And the same with everybody else on this planet. There's no reason for anyone to be fighting and killing and wounding and hurting. It's about forgetfulness. We've got collective amnesia going on. I do believe in collective enlightenment. I took a Mahayana initiation when I was 19 as a bodhisattva. I do believe in the possibility of collective enlightenment. But I'm in a hurry, which is why I've written this book, which is called Enlightenments. Because if we are seriously going to get this planet enlightened, we have to contribute maturely to the dialogue between rival enlightenment systems, right? All these osophies and ologies are different enlightenment systems. Join Islam, we're the true enlightenment. No, join Kabbalah, we know the real secrets. No, join anthroposophy, we know the real one, Well, come on guys, let's study them and compare and contrast them. So far as I know, this is the first book written to do that. What is the end goal of your system? What is enlightenment, actually? Does it mean you lose your body, but you get a rainbow body, so you can fly about and be very wise? Does it mean you go to a kind of heaven world, where you can commune with the saints and Jesus and then send down love? Does it mean you totally leave this entire planet because it's finished and you go to some other world? I've met people that answer these questions all these different ways. Or does it mean we transform the planet and stay in bodies and get enlightened but stay, just walking about? And that's what socialism said, that's what communism said. Let's build utopia on the planet, here and now, in the material world. I haven't finished the study. I'm suggesting as a planet we begin that dialogue. Let's share our esoteric wisdom across the systems. Ask the great Sufis, ask the great Kabbalists, ask the great Christian mystics. I've just been on Iona communing with St. Columba, who used to sit on a hill and talk to angels. It's called the Hill of the Angels. Read his story. Columba was a clairvoyant and a mystic, having incredible transpersonal experiences. Let's work out a common plan for enlightenment on the planet. That would include political, economic, social, cultural dimensions, but not only. Mainly it's about the metaphysical and psychological enlightenment, the healing of the wounded psyche of mankind. Okay? Right, that leads me to the next point, which is what is the potential contribution of all this to peace and reconciliation? Let's look at the theosophical contribution for a start. Theosophists have often been active in peace work, people like Annie Besant and so on. Why? I think it's to do with the ability to reach a level of synthesis above rival systems of thought. From its very beginning, the modern theosophical community was dedicated to, if you read the pledge, creating a kind of brotherhood beyond race, creed, sex, caste or colour. That was revolutionary at that time. It still is for some people. That is a peace declaration. So of course all the presidents, if you study the history of the TS internationally, I've been to Edinburgh and researched this, they're all active in some kind of peace work. And the same also at local level. I'm sure here in Edinburgh there are many individuals among this group that do the same. I think Theosophy looks for synthesis. The important thing is to suspend judgment in conflicts and practice what's called epoche, which is a very important philosophical term, suspension of judgment. Now, interestingly, it comes from the Jains. And I've just been in India talking to Jains who have been practicing non-violence ever since Mahavira. And before, they say Mahavira was just the latest of a series of Tirthankaras, which are ford crossers. Like, people didn't get all of us across the kind of chaos of this world. Where Buddhism and Jainism absolutely agree is in non-violence. That's the only way you can do it. You cannot get high up the spiritual ladder if you remain angry, violent, rage outbursts, the whole thing. And that's where I think we're stuck as a planet. And I think transpersonal history can therefore shed some enormous light on this. From a Jungian perspective, we're dealing with a conflicting psyche where different archetypes are clashing in the collective unconscious, if you want. And we have to heal these conflicts through understanding, the common consciousness that runs through them. I was reading downstairs a book by Annie Besant, just found it actually upstairs, on consciousness, this study in consciousness. Bless her, she was writing this stuff, 1905. And consciousness is the key here. Transpersonal history is history with consciousness put back in. And what interests me about consciousness studies, which is a new scientific field, is they are finally beginning to ask, what is consciousness? Where does it live? All the research of people like Peter Fenwick on near-death experience, David Lorimer and people, to me points unmistakably that it lives not just in the body, it lives beyond the body. When the body dies, there's what the ancient Greeks called the okema, the subtle body, the astral body, which survives death and has the capacity to interdimensionally travel, probably faster than light. I think science in the future, in the next few hundred years, will be researching this. That's psychic science, spiritual science. How does this relate to conflict resolution? Well, I chair 3 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, right? One for Britain and Ireland, modelled on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I've chaired 3 meetings in Belfast, Dublin and Holyhead, bringing together people on both sides, all sides of that tragic conflict, IRA people, Protestant people, victim people. And I do the same in the Middle East. I've been to Israel and Palestine, talked to Jewish, Muslim, Christian people, activists, victims, and again, tried to find the common ground. And just recently, I'm in the process of setting one up for the Balkans with a friend who's just visited my castle originally from Sarajevo. We're trying to get Sarajevo and Glasgow twinned because there's a concern that the Balkans might kick off again because there's a lot of unhealed business to do with Kosovo. And most world wars start in the Balkans, so I'm working on that. Now, how do I work as a transpersonal historian? I believe that conflict, when it breaks out, somewhere like the Balkans, let's say, break up in Yugoslavia, it was so involved with religious conflict. You have Serb Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Muslim, communist, in this ridiculous mélange, and they all start firing at each other. The theory behind transpersonal peacemaking is find out who among those cultures were actually enlightened. Every culture has a lineage of enlightened truth warriors or saints, right? If you can contact their spiritual energy field, right, through prayer, through study, through research, through pilgrimage, you can invoke those more positive energies, like the reason people go to Iona. Okay? So instead of invoking the dark energy of violence, you can actually consciously invoke the light energy of truth. And you see, saints don't fight, real ones. You can tell real saints by their non-violence. Sort of pretend saints that are religious rabble-rousers, of course they fight and they say, apparently, according to my friend, the chief imam of Bosnia, a Muslim chap, told all the Muslims of Bosnia not to go into any Christian houses because they're the enemy. Just the other week, right? It's nonsense, that kind of level of stuff. So, by contacting that transpersonal unity, I think we can do some healing. Not all esotericists or so-called esotericists are always benign. Another thing transpersonal history has to be aware of is that some people get a bit of esoteric knowledge and run with it and think they're very clever. And I refer, for example, to the chap in Norway who thought he was some kind of heroic Knights Templar, and was actually gunning down little Norwegian kids. That's the pathology caused by wrong kind of spirituality is actually very dangerous. So, you need to be aware of that. And the same with Hitler. He was a sort of esotericist who thought he was doing a good turn, but in the end, that whole movement went corrupt and crazy, psychopathic. So the healing is the crucial thing here. Right, I want to talk about the contribution, therefore, of theosophical history to the Gandhian tradition and non-violence specifically. It's a very important history. I was education officer for the Gandhi Foundation for about 5 years back in the 90s, working out of a flat called Kingsley Hall in London, and did a lot of research into Gandhi's studies and life. He lived in London, he came to study law, and he became a theosophist. He used to go to the headquarters, and I researched this in great detail. He was incredibly influenced by Theosophy, and in fact it was that turned him back to looking at Indian spirituality as valid. Because growing up in India, they all looked to the West. Western knowledge, science, reason was the good thing. But when he came to London, he met all these vegetarians and theosophists who said, my God, I ought to take my own culture more seriously. Not only that, but when he went to South Africa, it was giving talks in the Theosophical lodges in South Africa that launched his career as an activist. So it's interesting, isn't it, that Theosophy always talked about the Mahatmas. Well, here, in a sense, he was a Theosophical Mahatma. Now, he influenced, in turn, the Gandhian tradition influenced many other esoteric light workers, to use a phrase. When I was in the States, I trained as a mediator, and I met people that knew Martin Luther King. They helped train me. And I researched Martin Luther King's intellectual history. I didn't realise that he had been so strongly influenced by Gandhi, and that Martin Luther King studied esotericism and theosophy and mysticism as part of his own research work as a Christian theologian. Martin Luther King was a very profound philosopher and theosophist, effectively, who then had to live that message and ended his death prematurely. But if you go into it, he was aware of the entire kind of esoteric tradition I'm talking about. That's what gave him the strength to say that this racial thing is ridiculous. We are all soul energy. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white, brown, yellow, it's your soul quality that counts. And others, Tolstoy, another great non-violence leader, who influenced Gandhi, was a very advanced esotericist, a mystic a Christian esotericist. And so there's this pattern emerges. If you study the history of non-violence, you see that all the great non-violence leaders of history, because you can take this further back to Pythagoras and Buddha and Christ, you know, they were all advanced esotericists. We could call them theosophists. You know. Only transpersonal history can even begin to approach how we can make sense of these guys. It's not enough to say, well, they were the sons of God or something. That's a metaphor, fine. I'm not, you know, attacking traditional Christians who want to use that language of their particular avatar. But I would say we need to study it scientifically and actually understand what that means. You know, how can everybody attain that level of cognitive enlightenment that leads to the possibility of peace and non-violence? Okay, these keep popping up. I mean, the Dalai Lama is another example, Aung Suu Kyi. But you may remember a woman called Hilda Morell, who was a peace activist back in the 80s. And she was campaigning against nuclear energy and nuclear weapons in Shropshire. She lived in a remote farmhouse, and she was found dead in the 80s and had been killed. There's still question marks about that. Was it some rogue element in the government gone mad, silencing an intellectual? She was a Cambridge graduate, a very wise woman. Or was it just some opportunist thieves? Her nephew and his wife have given me what they regard as definite evidence that it was the former. It was a murder, covered up. I went on a pilgrimage to the cairn where her ashes were scattered a few years ago, and I was told by someone who knew her that all her peace work was inspired by her commitment to Theosophy, and particularly Alice Bailey and the Seven Rays teachings. Nobody knows that. She's just, you know, a peace activist. So there we are. There's another example of how peace often you find fueled by this kind of theosophical spirit. In my own work, I was director of the School of Non-Violence, which started with the Gandhi Foundation, and it continues now in this Castle of the Muses in Argyll. We've got a new base for that. I think it's kind of crucial work, and the reason I launched this task force for you know, a commission of inquiry into non-violence in our society was after I got back from my own a few weeks ago. It was to find that England had started doing all these riots. Now, I used to live in London. I lived in Peckham teaching mediation. You know, I lived in Islington. I've lived in Tottenham, Seven Sisters. You know, I worked in London. I lectured there for years. To suddenly read that the city's gone mad annoys me, right? And I think there's something going on with the soul of this country, the United Kingdom, if we're going to end up like that. It's to do with materialism. It's to do with all kinds of pressures, lack of spirituality, lack of ethics in the education system. Religious studies always marginalised, you know, in the school curriculum, because we've gone down a road of knowledge is only scientific or technical. That's the only thing that matters. And soul knowledge either doesn't exist or is just like a little add-on if you happen to be religious. And I think that's where this country's in danger of losing its soul. So I called for this task force. I sent Mike the document, yeah? And if anyone wants a copy, just put your email down on a piece of paper. And it's quite a thoroughly, you know, proposed suggestion that we need like a task force at the highest level involving educators, the police, you know, political leaders, religious leaders, community leaders, youth workers, parent groups, etc., to actually think about what are we creating a violent society, and if so, how? And how could we create a non-violent society? So I'd asked the Theosophical Society institutionally at national level to like submit a paper or something to this task force, and the Scottish branch can help with that. Okay, just a few more notes really, and then I'm going to finish. Just to say that transpersonal history is very much concerned with the history of science as well. I've taught courses for the University of Oxford on the history of sciences, and biology, chemistry, physics, maths, you know. And what I've discovered is that many of the greatest scientists were deeply spiritual thinkers, very profound seekers of truth. That's what led them to become scientists. I've been to the manor house where Newton, you know, lived in Cambridgeshire. You Newton's a good example. He was a deeply profound mathematician and scientist, but he was also an esotericist looking for absolute truth. And you may not know that he wrote a secret manuscript that was never published in his lifetime, which is basically pure theosophy, how all religions come from one common source. Until the University of Liverpool in 1950 had the courage. But not only him, but Einstein and Kepler and many of the greatest scientists, Lavoisier I mentioned earlier, who are Priestley, who discovered oxygen. Scratch a scientist, you find an esotericist, and often there's not a theosophist of some kind. Now that to me is something to sing from the rooftops and celebrate. Our education system, which is, no wonder we got rioting on the streets, the kids are absolutely brain dead from our education system because it bifurcates them. It says, here's science, that's for clever people that do maths, and here's all the other stuff. That's for soft people that can't do the real stuff. These guys creamed on do the engineering degrees. And, these guys they eventually riot, right? Or they do art. Now, that's just ridiculous. We have to make a marriage again between these are aspects of our nature: the artist, the scientist, the rational, the super rational. And we need an education system in this country, and indeed the world, that gives all of us the chance to develop and explore that. The ancient Greeks called it the nine muses. They used the iconography of the nine muses as goddesses of wisdom and inspiration. That's why I've invoked them in the Castle of the Muses here in Scotland. It's the whole round of learning, from natural science through to the arts and music. So I want to talk briefly. The same is true of the arts in terms of transpersonal inspiration. We were talking earlier about Handel, Haydn, Beethoven. These great musicians were profound mystics who transmitted their wisdom in the form of their music. The same with the greatest poets of this world. I run an order of peace poets. I'm a poet myself. I love the poets of this world who can, with word spinning, create peace. That's the job here. And the same with painters and the visual arts. There's the transpersonal history of the arts is just a field waiting to be explored. It's not being taught. It's being researched in secret, by devotees. I'm saying make it mainstream. Let's have an institute for transpersonal history in Edinburgh, or every city should have one. Okay. I want to just say theosophical history and for philosophical history. There's a whole thing, I don't have time to go into the details of that, but if you look at the history of philosophy as such, going right back to Pythagoras, and I want to share one thing. I've talked about what is enlightenment in the ancient, in all different rival systems. For Pythagoras, enlightenment had a word. The ancient Greek word for enlightenment is lysis, or lucis, right? Which means to dissolve, to soothe away, like having a water bath, jacuzzi, right? And so the metaphor for the Greeks was a water-based metaphor, unlike enlightenment, which is fire. The Greeks being the fishing people, loving the sea, Poseidon. And I think we, the Celts, in Scotland, we love the rain and we love the sea. I live on a sea loch. It's always like the sea is coming out my window all the time, most 6 months of the year. So lysis means release and solution. And it's the solution of a puzzle or a problem. And it's the origin of the word analysis, which means to solve it again. Ana means again, right? So you've been puzzling on something and finally you get there, you solve it. And psychoanalysis is the origin, it comes from the same root. So if you follow the history of philosophy back, you'll find that the whole purpose of philosophy, I just met through our friend, they graduated from the philosophy degree here in Edinburgh. And basically, she said they totally, sorry if there's anyone who teaches there, hands up, but basically just don't know what they're talking about. It's all head stuff, it's logical positivism, it's the same old, they'd shoot me for this lecture. But I mean, I've been through that, I've done my research, I've come out the other side, and I know that Analytical philosophy, in the best sense of Oxford analytical philosophy, actually is about enlightenment. You think very clearly about concepts, and you dissolve the problems that arise from their study. Which is why one of my fascinations is the history of language and words. And I've done a dictionary of terminology, Sanskrit, Hebrew, Greek, etc. If we don't study each other's philosophical terminology and language systems, how can we converse across cultures? So that's one of the books over there. Okay, if you look at philosophy and add in the transpersonal bit, then you're going to add in things like reincarnation, you're going to add in wisdom accrued over time. What happens to it? Where does wisdom and knowledge go between lives? Where's it stored? Not in the body goes. Are there Akashic libraries in the etheric world? What are they made of? Who's running them? How do you get an entrance ticket? All these are important questions for genuine philosophers, I would say. King Alfred the Great, who was the greatest king England ever had, said to his tutor Asa that when he died, he didn't have time to study all he wanted in this life because he was busy fighting Vikings all the time and battles. So when he got to heaven, could he please have time to study there? And Asa wrote back saying, "Dear king, I'm sure there will be libraries in heaven, and if there aren't already, they'll make them just for you." Okay. So I think that's a really nice idea. Okay, finally, I want to end this talk with just asking one practical question. So there's the theory. It's been a rushed little summary of like 30 years research, okay? Probably many lifetimes, actually. Don't tell anyone. So how to do it then? How to do transpersonal history? Well, it's a mixture of things, isn't it? Study, terribly important. Study skills. But in the kind of ideal college that I would like to teach in, the study skills include things like meditation, calming, like we had the music at the beginning of this talk. The way that kids, the violent, conflicting attitude and hustle-bustle of most academic programs doesn't allow, it's not conducive to enlightenment experiences. So I would say prayer should be part of study. And in the traditional model of the medieval university, you had your chapel, you had your prayer place, and your study place, and your library. In the Academy of Athens, you had a temple to the Muses. Bring prayer back into the mainstream, but it's non-denominational. It's scientific prayer that I'm interested in. There's no point sort of falling down on your knees and praying to some kind of past avatar to come and do work you should be doing. Elevate your consciousness. Learn what Iamblichus and all these great Theosophists talk about. What actually prayer is. And loads of scientific studies have found that prayer actually works. There's an energy you can tap into. It's also about dialogue. It's about conversation. And I hope in a minute, you'll ask me some questions. And go on talking, and that's how we learn, isn't it? Dialogue. It's what Socrates called dialectic. Nowadays we have the internet, fantastic tool. It's all there, but you have to learn how to use it with discernment. Libraries, love them. Spend time. This is a great one. Use it. Go to lectures. Hear people talk. It's also about practicing non-violence. I don't think you can do transpersonal history for the wrong reasons. Dear old Steiner, in his book Knowledge of Higher Worlds, talks about, there are guardians at the gates of wisdom. If you are going to progress up the spiritual path, you can't sneak in for the wrong reason. The devil can't get into heaven in order to cause hell. There's a way of blocking that, and it goes to devilish people. Not that I'm advocating a literalist theist view of the afterlife. I'm using that as a metaphor. The devil story is much more interesting, and I'm working on a transpersonal conference, an interfaith dialogue on the nature of the devil and his role in history, because I think that's an archetype that's bugging people, especially Islamic sort of fundamentalists, but also Christian fundamentalists and so on. So, no, non-violence. has to be core to me, but of thought, word and deed. You can explore things like channeling. You know, I don't know if any of you do or can, but find out, you know, how that works, research it, meet people, talk to them. I met a woman who was channeling interdimensional beings from other galaxies, who was running workshops for the Cabinet Office in Downing Street. She wasn't doing the channeling for the Cabinet Office, but she was doing that privately, was teaching leadership skills to the Cabinet. This was under the last John Major government, way back in the 90s, I think. Do things like hypnotherapy, past life regression. That's a way of doing transpersonal history. Find your own past lives. Do it with other people. Past life regression is, if it's, I mean, I suspend judgment. I do the epique thing. You know, I've met loads of people that say they're this, that, or the other. I suspend judgment. If it works for them and it helps them be better people, you know, then that's a truth for them. And above all, ask questions. I hope I've stimulated a few today. You know, usually when I do a paper, I just write it in the form of questions. I think questioning is the most profound gift we can all practice. Networking is vital. Learn from each other, from your friends. We've got the internet. And travel. Travel is you cannot be a genuine transpersonal historian without travelling. And I go back to my dear old, the founder of the discipline is Herodotus, who was the ancient Greek who founded history, known as the father of history. But he also was a great traveller. He travelled to Babylon, Egypt, all over Greece. He went everywhere and anywhere to try and understand why the Persians and Greeks hated each other so much. He began the scientific study of history. And in a way, transpersonal history has just sort of been, it's an homage to Herodotus' work, which means, by the way, the gift of the goddess, the gift of Hera. And, you know, she being the consort of Zeus, I'm going to finish the talk there. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. And, yeah. What I want to do, I'm going to give you a piece of paper, and I want you all to write down a question, right? Okay, if you don't mind. With a pen. Something that's come up, so we're going to have like a bit of silence.